Good evening, everybody. Welcome to JWA's Book Talks. I'm Judith Rosenbaum of the Jewish Women's Archive. Really glad to be back with all of you tonight, today, wherever you are. Please say hello in the chat box. We love to know who is with us in the room. Make sure you're chatting to everyone so we can all see your messages. Also, the chat box is where you can put questions throughout the program, and I will try to bring them into the conversation. A few words about JWA for anybody who is new to us. We are a digital archive. We work to expand and transform the way that we understand history and Jewish culture by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. We also pay special attention to how gender functions in the past and present. And we do all of this work because we believe that uncovering a more diverse and nuanced story will help us create a better world. So we appreciate your partnership in this work and are really glad you're here with us tonight. And the book talks are really just one small piece of the work that JWA does. So I hope that you will take the time to check out jwa.org and explore the full range of everything that we do and offer. A quick logistical note, if anybody would like captioning, you can turn them on by clicking the button that says CC or show captions at the bottom of your screen, and that should work for you. I am delighted to welcome our featured author for today. Jacqueline Friedland is the USA Today and Amazon bestselling author of both historical and contemporary women's fiction, including Counting Backwards, which is her fifth novel and the one we will be discussing tonight. She is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania and NYU Law School and practiced as a commercial litigator for, as she says, as long as she could stand it. She then returned to school to earn her MFA in creative writing from Sarah Lawrence and has been writing ever since. Her books have been awarded the 2020 and 2021 gold medals in fiction from Reader's Favorite and also been named the 2021 Kirkus Review's Best Indie Book of the Year, the She Reads Best Book Club Pick of 2021, and the Women's Fiction Writers Association Star Finalist for 2022. Very cool. Jackie lives in Westchester, New York, with her husband, her 4 children, and 2 dogs. Welcome, Jackie. We're so glad to have you with us tonight.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Wonderful. Well, we are very glad to have the opportunity to talk to you about this book, which is chock full of so many things that are juicy and timely. For those of you who haven't read it yet, it is a dual narrative that alternates between the story of Jessa Gidney, who's a lawyer living in Manhattan in 2022, who is both trying to get pregnant and make partner at her firm, and Carrie Buck, who is a real life historical figure in 1920s Virginia, who is used as the test case for the Supreme Court case Buck v. Bell, which allowed forced sterilization in state institutions. And the book touches on so many themes. My dog is deciding she needs to make a lot of noise right now. So many themes like reproductive justice, both today and historically, immigration law, fertility and infertility, grief and loss, the Holocaust, eugenics, family secrets. And I'm curious, Jackie, where this book, what was the kernel for you? Where did it start for you?
So it actually started quite a long time ago in 1995 when I was a senior in high school. My history teacher gave us an assignment to find a Supreme Court case, anything from 1900 to 1945, and that was going to be like our case for the semester, and we were going to be wedded to it, write a paper on it, do a project and a presentation. And so off I went to the library and I'm reading through these Supreme Court cases. And for anyone who's ever read one, you know they're dense and they're long and they're kind of boring. And I stumbled on one that was only 3 paragraphs long. So before even reading it, I was like, oh, I found it.
This is the one for me.
Yep. And it turned out it was this case, Buck versus Bell, that was decided in 1927, where the justices determined that Carrie Buck, who was a 17-year-old girl, should be sterilized against her wishes because she was what they called at the time feeble-minded. And these justices thought they were doing the world a great favor, even the liberal justices, by preventing more children with any sort of flaw, as they would have deemed it, from being born. And this was during the eugenics craze in America, and it was just this mind-boggling thing for me to read at age 17 myself, thinking about this 17-year-old girl and what had happened to her. And it really stuck with me for years and years. And fast forward to 2020, and I was reading a news article, and I was reading like a news publication, and there was a headline that said the uterus collector. So I thought, gross. And then, of course, immediately clicked the link. And it was a story about an immigration detention center in Georgia where women were claiming they were being sterilized without their consent. And my mind, of course, immediately jumped back to Carrie Buck. And I'm thinking, here it is. It was 96 years later at the time. And it's basically the same story coming out. And how can this be? And, I'd already published 4 books and I was like, I just knew that this one had to be my next one, that I had to find a way to tell Carrie's story and the story of what these women were claiming down in Georgia in a way that brought it all together and showed the way that history rhymes, even if it's not exactly the same, and also shed light on issues in our country that still need much more attention than they're getting.
Yeah, one of the things that I didn't realize until I read your book is that Buck v. Bell was never overturned. I mean, I knew about the case from my own study of history, um, and I knew that this was still an issue that came up, but I didn't realize that that case was like still on the books. I mean, I know it's been undermined a little bit by some other decisions, but that was just sort of shocking. Like, how could that be?
It's crazy to me too. I went off after college, I went to law school. We never really learned about this case. I assumed, of course, it had to have been long overruled. And, part of why it's never been overturned is because so many states have repealed the statutes that allow for compulsory sterilization. So there's not been an opportunity for a law to be challenged by the Supreme Court that would explicitly overrule a case.
Right.
However, there are many states that still do allow for compulsory sterilization in certain circumstances. So, an overruling would affect some of those laws in ways that we don't even know.
Right. Yeah. It is kind of mind-boggling. Um, so once you knew that this was how you were, a story that you wanted to tell, how did you come up with kind of the structure and the Jessa character and build the fullness of the story around it?
So I wanted to be very careful with the modern day story, these women in the immigration detention center. I didn't want to presume to tell the stories of these women who have had such a different, like, lived experience than I have. So instead, I took it from the other side of the perspective of what would an American born female attorney feel and think and see walking into a situation like this? How would she handle it? How would she approach it? So I dreamt up Jessa, who goes into this facility thinking she's taking an open and shut immigration case, to stay in order of deportation. And when she's in the facility, she begins to suspect this kind of medical abuse. And it very quickly became this kind of Erin Brockovich idea in my head of this woman who has being supported by nobody, who people are saying, like, not in America, not in 2020, and you're going to risk your job and you're going to risk your personal life, and don't do it. And so that was sort of how the Jessa part came to be. And for Carrie, I really think I've carried her with me for 3 decades more or less. And so her story is based so much on the historical record. And I really tried to embellish as little as possible so that I could give her as much of a voice as possible, and, the platform that she never really had. And the only thing that I had to do is that she was institutionalized, for those who haven't read it. And after her time in the institution, there's much less material available on what the rest of her life was like. So I had to sort of fill in the gaps there. But then I saw so many parallels between the two storylines that it was like they wove themselves together while I just sat there and watched.
What was your research process like? Did your legal training come in handy?
It definitely came in handy. And this is, when I left the law to become a full-time writer, I said, I'm not going to do like the John Grisham thing. I'm not going to focus on the law. And with each book I write, it becomes progressively more law heavy.
Mm.
But I think one thing that I did take away from being an attorney and going to law school is that I apparently love research. And I don't stop until I feel like I have every last detail, under my belt. And for Carrie, there's a number of books written about her case and about the history of sterilization in America, and um, sort of what the time was like. I actually, one thing I really like to do when I write about history is look at old newspapers. And it's cool. You can find them online through the Library of Congress. And it's reminiscent of the old microfiche from like when I was a kid in the library, where you could like move the whole sheet and zoom in and zoom out. And so I've referred to a lot of old newspaper articles for her. And also, two of my earlier books are historical fiction that take place in the South in the period of time leading up to the Civil War. Now, the 1920s are obviously after the Civil War, but they're not like in the scheme of the world, they're not that much later. So I already had quite a foundation in Southern history, and I just had to sort of fill in what was going on in Virginia precisely at that time, and cool things like there was like the PepsiCo bottling plant in that part of Virginia, things like that. And as far as the research for contemporary times, I actually spoke with the reporter who broke the case from Georgia. Um, and he was so lovely and said that you have to write this book and you have to spread the word. He also gave me the warning that the doctor who was accused of these acts down in Georgia has already sued a few people and is very litigious in his words. And he said, so just, be careful how you approach it. And so because of that, I moved my story to New Jersey. And made some other changes. And every time I do a public appearance, the lawyer in me forces to say that everything that came out of Georgia was only allegations and has yet to be proved in a court of law. But I will say there was a federal class action filed. There was a bipartisan congressional investigation where the people on that committee did find that there were unnecessary invasive gynecological procedures performed in the facility. The facility has since been shut down as far as being an ICE detention center, and all of the inmates who were there for those purposes have either been released or they've been moved to a different facility in a different part of Georgia. So I present that information to all of you to do with what you will.
Exactly. Um, what was it like to write? So part of the book is written in Carrie's voice, and I'm curious what it was like to write that part of the book, and whether writing both in, a historical character, but also a real character feels different from writing the other fictional part.
I actually find it easier to write those historical characters who have fallen on hard times or been, downtrodden for one reason or another. I find that I'm much more generous with those characters. I sort of make them as flawless as I can, while also trying to keep them true to who they supposedly were. Versus like a Jessa character who's a modern day female attorney who's, born and raised in New York, just like me. And so with a character like that, I give her all sorts of flaws and I make her, a little whiny and a little, having some psychological issues and, making snap judgments that are wrong and things like that. And the Carrie voice just kind of it sounds ridiculous to say you let the character take over and just come out of you, but really I mean that. And she just existed inside of me and came out and I let her do her thing.
Hmm. That's kind of amazing. It was really interesting to kind of get inside her mind. And as a historian, I was also thinking about I was thinking about your research process and sort of imagining what you had to do to make that voice real, while also staying true to the narrative. So kudos for that, because that
Thank
seems
you.
challenging. Although it was interesting, another one of our authors who we spoke with this month, Alina Adams, who wrote a historical fiction book, was saying that she actually finds historical fiction easier because you don't have to make as much up. Like you have a structure to hang things on, which I thought was interesting. I had never thought about it that way before.
I agree with that completely. And there's other reasons I think historical fiction is easier. Also, for example, if you're writing a book now about a modern day location, everybody who's reading your book has potentially been to that spot, and they all have their own perceptions of what that spot is like.
Mm.
Versus none of us have been to 1840s Charleston, South Carolina, which was the location of my first book, and it just gives you a little bit more freedom And the other thing is that one thing that I find very helpful in writing historical fiction is to get sort of the background details. So sort of like what I was saying about the Pepsi plant, but like
Mhm.
what were the brand name clothing companies or the what were they selling at the pharmacy? What were people using to wash their hair and all of those little details. And it builds such a complete picture for you that
Mhm.
then it kind of just jumps onto the page.
Yeah, that makes sense. Um, yeah, those are important because if those are wrong, it feels really wrong.
Mhm.
Um, so one of the other elements of the book that I think we haven't mentioned yet is that, or maybe I mentioned it very in passing at the beginning, is that Jessa is going through fertility challenges in the book. There's the piece of Carrie's story that is mirrored by the present day immigrants who are experiencing, you know, medical procedures without their consent. But then there's also this other theme around motherhood and fertility and what it means to not be able to control that in the ways that you want. So tell us a little bit about how you thought about building that arc and that piece of Jessa's story.
So when Jessa goes into the detention facility, she's still very focused on her career and advancing in her career. And she has, a moral compass and she's worried about what might be happening to these women. But she also has already been created or described to the reader as the type of person who might put her career first, who might say, I wish I could help, but, but when you layer onto that, the fact that she herself is trying to get pregnant, so she's kind of hyper focused on biological processes and the body and the desire for biological offspring and all of this. And also you learn pretty much right away that she lost her parents when she was a child, and so this urge to have more biological family is like really strong in her. All of those facets just sort of make the fact of like depriving women of the right to have children without their consent, it makes it so much more glaring, and it makes her willing to risk all these other parts of her life to help women and to help prevent this from happening to anybody else because she's so in touch with how awful and painful it could be.
Hmm.
So that was sort of my thought process there.
Hmm. Yeah, and it was interesting also to think about, as I was reading it, to think about her very sort of personal story and then these kind of larger structural issues that get in the way for, I mean, for potentially for everyone, but in particular ways for these women who are in the detention center, and how she's trying to kind of like wrap her brain around the structural pieces and the personal pieces at the same time.
Yes, exactly. And there's so many things, so much that she doesn't understand about the experiences these women are having, and so much that she believes she does understand also, which also makes her feel, and it's that bit of understanding that like bonds her to these women and makes her feel like if they are in this situation and they need somebody to help them, it's got to be Jessa.
Hmm. Yeah. Um, So, as you mentioned, she also is someone who has lost her parents. And so there are a lot of pieces in this story that are about sort of legacy. It's many of the characters take legacy very seriously. We haven't really talked about Jess's husband yet, but his name is Vance. He's the grandson of Holocaust survivors and very much connected. In fact, his work is connected to that piece of his family story. Um, Jessa is thinking about how to carry on the legacy of her parents who died when she was young. Was raised by her grandmother, who has her own kind of burdens of legacy related to her father. Um, and I'd love to hear about sort of how you thought about that whole very rich package of different kinds of legacy and how they play out.
Um, I'm gonna have to take you guys out of the magic of the book and show you a little of like how the sausage is made. In order to tell the stories of both Jessa in basically the present and Carrie 100 years ago, there needed to be something that connected them other than just the issue of reproduction. And I'm not going to spoil it and say what it was, but I thought initially that they might be family, and I wanted readers to think they might be family, even though we don't know if, again, with no spoilers, but I think this is already out of the bag. Like we know Carrie had no offspring. So, but if Jess is a relative, Carrie was not Jewish. Jessa should not be Jewish. However, as a writer, as a Jewish writer, I tried to include Jewish representation in all of my books, and I feel very strongly about this because I feel that so many people, when they think of Jewish books, they think of Holocaust books, they think of books about people grappling with their faith, but it's nice to just have some books where there's just Jewish characters living life and the drama happens, but oh, they happen to be Jewish, and maybe there's a Shiva, maybe there's a bris, but it's not about the fact that they're Jewish. So I really wanted to have a Jewish character, so I decided to make Jess's husband Jewish. Um, and they are obviously intermarried, but again, it's a type of representation, and there's plenty of Jewish people who marry outside of the religion. And um, then when I gave a draft of the book to my editor, the my editor said to me, "I think you need to make Vance worse. He's got to be more of a jerk." And I'm
Hmm.
like, "No, he was my Jewish representation, and I don't want that to all like just be a bad guy." So, I gave him some nice Jewish relatives and made him worse, and we compromised. And I feel like I've lost the thread of what you asked
I was
me.
asking about legacy and sort of thinking about
Oh,
that question.
yes. So one thing that I discovered in my research while I was writing the book is that the American eugenics research was actually part of the foundation for what went over to Germany and gave them the idea of creating a master race, which is horrifying when you think about it, because the people who were funding the research in America were our, great philanthropists like the Kellogg's and the Vanderbilts and the Carnegies and all these people who really thought they were doing something to help humanity. And they were wrong, but they didn't mean to be. They wanted to be, benefiting the world. And the legacy of that, and that how this research that was meant as a good thing could then be taken over to Germany and like perverted into something entirely different, um was weighing on me. And I'm like, how do I show that? And so I gave Vance these grandparents who were Holocaust survivors to show how what happened in America went over to Germany, came back to America, and how it's everything is connected, and how grandkids want to honor their grandparents and their family traditions and all of these things, and how somebody else's past and somebody else's family tradition or legacy could negatively impact your own, even though the two of you in the present might have imagined yourselves separate from it. Are we ever really separate from our pasts or not? And that was a big question to me as I was writing. So that's sort of a roundabout way of answering what you asked.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, it was really interesting to think about. First of all, I tend to think, I guess because of the nature of my work, which is Jewish, I tend to think about legacy so much in Jewish terms. And it was really interesting to see that represented in the book in the character of Vance, but also to think about all these other ways that that legacy kind of played out. And I think there are ways also that you deal with some of the complications of it. Like there's this one point where Jessa, who is feeling the kind of weight of the case that she's taken on and these women's lives who now are like they're depending on her, and she's worried that she's not up to it. And she feels very drawn to the work in part because of her family, but then she's also like, am I like pursuing this case in order to live out something connected to my legacy when it's actually not about me, it's about these women's lives? And sort of like, how do our own understandings of our legacy, how can that be both like a wonderful um, sort of selfless thing and also be a very selfish thing because it's very like focused on yourself.
I do think there's definitely a selfish aspect. Again, going back to me not being so generous with Jessa in creating her. In the beginning of the book, when she first says to this woman Isabel in the facility, like, "I want to help you," And Isabel says, no, like I don't want to ruffle any feathers in here. I don't want retaliation. I'm not doing this. There's a very valid argument to be made that Jessa should have let it go. That as a lawyer, she should have heard her client say, I don't want to pursue this, and she should have dropped it. But she, for herself, needs to pursue it. And so she pushes, and then ultimately it turns out to be the right thing. But she didn't know that at the beginning.
Right. Yeah, exactly. She did kind of take a risk with their lives in some ways. Um, Also related to the theme of legacy is the theme of like intergenerational trauma, which I think comes up for several of the characters as well. And there's this one part where Jessa even like talks about wanting, the whole thing of having children as being about, sort of being able to have her parents back or sort of being able to, she's very driven by that. Um, and I'm curious sort of how you thought about how you wove that piece in and the role that it plays in the story.
So I think I'm like pretty upfront in the book that Jessa has had a lot of psychological difficulty with the loss of her parents, and she's been in and out of therapy since she was a little kid, and she has these sort of panic attacks or these moments where she freezes. And so she is clearly, I mean, not even intergenerationally, she is just herself traumatized by that loss. And so but she feels very much like what really spoke to me is she has this moment where she's thinking about having a baby and how if it's a biological baby as opposed to like an adopted baby, she could maybe hear the sound of her mother's laugh again or see the exact color of her father's eyes. And on the one hand, it's like you can understand that and how she would feel like she needs that. And on the other, if she's so desperate for a kid, there's so many ways to have children. And why does it have to be like why she's so focused on the biological? Um, but I also think I think part of it though is a feeling of responsibility. Like she has this almost like a guilt, like first of all, she can't let go of maybe it was her fault that her parents got into a car accident. And also I think she feels like a sense of responsibility to bring back some part of their legacy. And the same is true with Vance, with his grandparents having been Holocaust survivors, that he feels a responsibility to protect his them and himself and their offspring. And I think it gets really tied up and complicated as it's going, but that's where I was coming at it from.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's the sort of flip side of legacy, right? Like there's all these ways that legacy can be so powerful and enriching, and there's also hard parts of legacy and the things that we're carrying around that we've inherited that we're trying to
Well,
make sense of.
then you also have Jessa's grandmother who has her own the picture of her family and her parents that she has painted for Jessa throughout Jessa's childhood, and then the reality that she ultimately reveals. And I think that one thing I love is the idea of intergenerational relationships, amongst the living, and how there's a tendency, I think, of younger people to acknowledge that the older people are so wise and they know so much, but sometimes it goes too far, and we put so much faith in the people who are older than we are simply because of age that mistakes get made and we don't think to question. And so I also wanted to bring that in and show that. But I do have to say, when I was writing the book, I was almost finished with it. And I was chatting with a friend who had just been watching a nature show. I forget what it was, but she mentioned to me that they said on this nature show that humans are the only species where the grandmother or where women, females, live for a long time after they are able to reproduce.
Hmm.
And they think it's because those women continue to serve a biological function for younger generations of providing the wisdom and caretaking and things like that, and also additional things that they think have not yet been discovered. But I do think so. I think it plays on both sides that, on the one hand, we put too much stock in our grandparents or whoever, and on the other, we need them and they serve a real biological function for us. So I was excited when she told me that tidbit at that moment.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I have never really thought about that in biological terms. I mean, we think about it all the time at JWA in terms of, family stories and one of the things that we talk about often in our oral history work is that because I think often people think of oral history, we do a lot of oral history work, and we think often people think like about just grandchildren interviewing their grandparents. And one of the things that we often encourage is like, well, why shouldn't it be go both ways? Like we learn a lot from older people, but also older people learn a lot from younger people. And I think you see that in Jess's relationship with her grandmother too. Like her grandmother grows over the course of the novel, and in part because of what she sees, like because of conversations she has with Jessa, and it's really beautiful.
Thanks. I believe that too. It makes me think of like this very senior college professors who are nearing retirement and how they seem so much younger than their peers because they're surrounded by college students and it keeps them, learning new things and staying current and all of that. So,
Right.
yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah. Um, so we've referenced that there are some family secrets here. We don't need to go into necessarily what they are, but family secrets can be such a great, I can see how they are a great plot
Device?
ingredient device. Yes, exactly. Um, what was the kind of, how did you add the family secrets piece into this story?
Ooh, that's a hard question to answer without spoiling.
Hmm.
I wanted to do something unexpected. I feel that so many times when you read a dual timeline novel, it always ends up being, I found my grandmother's letter. I found these letters, and it turns out she was my great grandmother. So I didn't want it to play out that way. I wanted to come up with a sort of a scenario that you don't see every day. So there is a connection between Jessa and a character in the past, but it's not one that you would ever expect.
Hmm.
And that was how I wanted to have it. So she would feel, in addition to her current connection to the case because of her own fertility journey and everything like that, she also actually has like a historical connection in like grounded in real events from this, well, real fictional events that attached her to it.
Yeah. I was also just thinking as you were talking that as, in terms of what we were saying about legacy, in some ways, family secrets becomes the sort of it's the complicator of legacy. Like we think of legacy of being as being, you know, not always good, but things that are sort of known. And then there's the piece of family legacy that are the hidden pieces that we don't necessarily know, and we may never know, or we might find out and they're big things or not. But there's sort of like that other hidden component of the legacy piece.
And by the way, how common must that be given how, especially for like people of our age, how our great grandparents, et cetera, like there's not much available for us to look at and see and comb through, versus I think about for my kids when they want to look at like their grandparents, like there will be photos and video and, documents and digital files. And I wonder if there will be secrets anymore for them. Who
Right.
knows?
Right. I mean, or you think about all the secrets that are being unearthed now because of um, DNA testing, right?
Yeah.
Like that have just upended. So I know several families that discovered like hidden relatives and or genetic connections among people who they were not what they thought they were, and that definitely changes. But I also think the other piece is that people talk a lot more openly about a lot of things now than they used to. So there's so many. I think some of the family secrets that used to exist that don't exist in quite the same way. Not that everybody talks about everything, but there were a lot more things that were unspoken and sort of shameful in the past that are much less so now.
Yes, agreed.
So that will be an interesting thing to that will be different in the future. Um, this sort of goes along a little bit with Secrets piece, which is that it's also really a story about forgiveness in a lot of ways. Um, both how we forgive others and also how we forgive ourselves. Um, and I found that really interesting because I think we're not living in a very forgiving time right now. Um, so I'm curious how you thought about that and whether whether you were thinking about like how do you both fight against the things that are bad and then also cultivate a spirit of forgiveness at the same time.
It's interesting for me, the idea, the focus was on forgive characters forgiving themselves. And I think that in order to do that, they have to like let go of their anger at other people, even though they're not necessarily like actively forgiving them. So for example, Jess's grandmother has anger about her childhood and how, like, what happened to her and how she grew up. And she reaches like this epiphany through Jessa where she realizes, like, it's okay. I don't have to hide who I was or where I came from, and I can be comfortable being myself. And that's her journey that Jessa brings her to. And in that way, Jessa can grow, like, Jessa also grows throughout the story. And there are people in her life who have not been the best influences in her life. And instead, I think she realizes, like, oh, I made a mistake by choosing to be with you. Not like I need to forgive you, but I need to forgive myself for thinking this was a good fit. And in doing that, it's like she's no longer angry because she didn't realize that these were just a bad match. And I think she herself as a character is a bad judge of character. She misjudges her husband at the beginning. She misjudges her coworker. She walks into this detention facility totally tone deaf in her fancy jewelry with her engraved pens, and she makes these snap decisions and doesn't always think through what she's doing. And as the story progresses, she begins to understand that maybe she would benefit from taking a step back, from looking at things from a different perspective, from reevaluating conceptions she's held most of her life about who she is or who she should try to be. And when she can let that go and allow herself to just explore where she is in the moment and where she wants to go, it allows her to just breathe and move forward on her journey in a way where it's like the anger at everyone else just like releases.
Hmm. Yeah, it is interesting. Um, and I think the grandmother also, sort of, as you said, like comes to understand through Jessa how to forgive, but she is better at sort of recognizing people's um complexity, I guess. That people, there's one point where she says, like, people can be many things, like they're not all good or bad. And um that really struck me because I think that's hard to hold sometimes now. And I think about it even in terms of just like the question of eugenics, right? Like um eugenics, clearly we understand now that is like a very dangerous way to look at the world. Um, it's racist and horrible. And as you said, like it was in 100 years ago, it was a progressive idea. And like it was about trying, it came out of a sense of like, how can we make the world a better place and like reduce suffering? And then it was taken in very, very bad directions. I mean, it was very misguided. But it's interesting now because it's like I think it's very hard for people to look back. This comes up in our work because we have a lot on the history of um, reproductive justice and on Jewish women's involvement with Margaret Sanger, for example. And Sanger has been kind of tarred by her association with eugenicists and in this same period of the 1920s. Um, and that came having studied her, like I know that she was really just pragmatic and like trying to work with whoever she thought could get women more rights. And that was a bad compromise that she made. It has not stood the test of time. Um, but I definitely don't want to like erase her name from history, right? Like, so it's like, how do we recognize the things that we've learned and have realized are really bad and dangerous and sort of acknowledge that harm and then like also understand things in the context of their own time and like figure out how we cannot totally vilify people who were living. I don't know. I mean, I think it's a very complicated question.
I agree so completely. I think, when you think about how the idea of eugenics began, it makes sense. Like you can breed out disease, you can breed out pain. That sounds great, until you start trying to make a list of, well, what would go on to that list. And, you start with like cancer or some it's something everyone would agree is a bad thing. But then you go to like blindness, and while those of us with sight might say, "Oh yeah, get rid of blindness," the people in the blind community, I think a lot of them would disagree and say like their experience, they're happy with it, and they don't want that bred out, and it just goes on from there.
Right.
For me, another thing that was crazy is I grew up in Syosset on Long Island, and the eugenics records office, the lab, was in Cold Spring Harbor, which was more or less in my backyard, many years before I was born. But it then became the same property became the Cold Spring Harbor labs where DNA was discovered.
Mm.
And that was, many years after the eugenics phase. So it's like you had this horrible result in the 1920s, and then you fast forward a little, and this major important discovery came out of the same place, and it just shows you how you don't understand, like we can't understand yet where things are going to go. And there are in legitimately complicated situations that still arise about sterilization in the disabled community. There are some people who are so severely disabled that, like when they menstruate, it's so upsetting to them, and they can't wear any of the products, and and it's the people who are trying to care for them. It's so difficult. And I don't wouldn't presume to say they should be sterilized or not, but it shows there's like more sides to this of like it's complicated it's just really complicated.
Is really complicated. And I think, in large part, your story is really a story that's about power and agency, and especially about gender and power and agency. Um, and that plays out in so many different complicated ways. And I think like you see that actually really well in the cases of Carrie and Jessa because they have very different lives. Like Jessa has a lot more resources than Carrie. She definitely is like not, it's not like they're on an equal, their issues around power and agency are not the same issues. But she also is not free of issues of power and agency in her life. That's like a huge issue that she's dealing with is, you know, how much does she own her own power and where does she have power and where doesn't she? And I don't really know what my question is, but but I think that that's like a really to be able to see that that plays out in so many different ways. It's not clear cut always, and it may be like I think it is interesting to see how, particularly in a case like Jessa, where it's really not clear cut, because you sort of want to be like, come on, like take more control. But what are the things that hold people back from that, even if it seems like they could act more?
Yeah, I agree. And I I wasn't coming at this story to play with gender outside of reproduction. And then I realized as the story was being written that gender was everywhere. And it's sort of, I was raised to believe, just work hard. And if you set your mind to something, it doesn't matter whether you're a girl or a boy or whatever, you will succeed if you've worked hard enough. So that's sort of the lens through which I view everything. And yet, when the book, like you see these moments of Jessa in her job where she's not getting respect, or, and in her marriage, and these ways that like you don't even necessarily realize you're consciously thinking about it, and yet it's because of gender. So that was like eye-opening for me, even as I was writing it.
Hmm. That is interesting to think of like things appearing to you that you weren't sort of consciously thinking about.
Hmm. Like, why wasn't she advancing at work when other people were? And, and like, yeah, she made a mistake, but is that all there was to it?
Right, for sure. Yeah. Um, this is a very different question, but I would love to hear a little bit about the pomegranate on the cover. The cover of the book is really beautiful. There's one place in the book, I think, where you mention a pomegranate seed, but it's in the context of those emails about the size of an embryo at different stages of a pregnancy. And at one point, it's a pomegranate seed. Um, did you like, were you looking for a pomegranate cover? I like it also just like I love pomegranates and they strike me as very Jewish. And I was curious if that was kind of like a Jewish symbol that you wanted to put in there, or if it was just kind of was chosen by the designer without your input.
So my publisher made the cover, and they sent me through email, here we're sending you like four drafts and let us know which one you like best. And the only difference between the four drafts was the color of the font. So
Hmm.
this was the cover. And the I saw it and I said to my husband, they gave me a Jewish fruit. And I'm like, I didn't know why there was a pomegranate on the cover. And quite frankly, I had forgotten that I had referenced a pomegranate seed in the book itself. But so I asked them, like I said, it's so pretty, but like why the pomegranate? And they told me that the pomegranate is an ancient symbol of fertility, which as soon as they said it, I was like, oh, that makes a ton of sense. Because if you look at it, especially the one they put on the cover, it's like really pulpy and fleshy, and the seeds do look like seeds in a fertility way. And
Mhm.
so I was excited about it for that reason. And it's also like it's like a little like bloody and gruesome in the way that you might think about unwanted medical procedures. And then I gave it more thought and was thinking about it also kind of looks like the four chambers of a heart.
Hmm.
And given that this is a story, largely about family and love and connection, that felt good to me. And then on top of everything else, the Judaism connection, especially with a character in the book who has a connection to, having loved ones who were in the Holocaust and all of that. It just, and, for those who don't know, they say that there's 613 seeds in a pomegranate, just like there are 613 commandments in the Torah. And I feel that even though, as I said earlier, this is not a Jewish book, I do think that it's Jewish in the sense that the message of the book is that you have to act righteously and stand up for others. And so to have this sort of Jewish fruit as the emblem of the whole book felt really right to me. So as I said, it's great. No changes. You pick the font.
Yeah, it was great. It's really a beautiful cover. It's very striking and it does feel like it resonates on so many levels.
Thank you.
Um, do you have a new project?
I do. I actually have a manuscript due to my publisher tomorrow,
Oh
but
wow.
the nerd in me took care of it, and it's handed in. And it is another story about women. It's two women at very different phases of their life, a mother, a middle-aged mother, and a college student, female athlete, both of whom are sort of crumbling under the weight of all of their personal obligations, and they are brought together and somewhat saved by their relationship with an autistic teenager.
Mm.
And it's somebody had asked me about this book if I was going to write a sequel, and I said no. And then a few minutes later, I was thinking about my next book, and I was realizing even though it's not a sequel to Counting Backwards, I do think on some level it's an answer to Counting Backwards in that it's the autistic character in the book who is the hero in the next one. And I feel really good about getting to portray someone with autism that way after having to live so long in Carrie's life, even though she was not actually intellectually disabled in any way, and that was something foisted on her. Just the treatment of someone in her position versus the opposite felt good to me.
Hmm. Interesting. There's a question from Molly Ann about whether there's anyone in your family with autism that.
Um, yes and no. I grew up with a mother who was sort of a pioneer in the field of autism, and I was constantly with her in and out of schools as she was running programs for kids with autism and she built the first program in the country for college readiness for kids with autism. And my kids have volunteered in her school, and it was always just sort of, there wasn't one person with autism in my life, there were so many.
Hmm.
So I feel like I really have had a unique view into that world through my mom.
Hmm. Great. Um, we were talking a little bit before we came on about the reception of the book, and you shared that like for some reason the news media doesn't necessarily want to cover this topic because it feels so relevant. But um, uh, it's a strange time to be putting things out there in the world. What is it like? How can we support authors and specifically Jewish authors who may not be getting attention for various reasons right now?
So the very best thing you can do for Jewish authors is if you like a book that they've written, go online and leave reviews on Amazon and on Goodreads. It makes a huge difference. Many of us, including myself, are getting reviews right now that say 1 star, the author is a Zionist, or similar things. And the one thing that really helps authors in general is feedback from readers. So people really rely on that. And as far as like people not wanting to hear about reproduction and immigrants right now, I think the press is underestimating readers. I think that they think, people are tired, the news is hard. Yes, we can all agree on that, but it doesn't mean we all just want to read like light, easy beach reads. What there's the we can think about multiple things at once and multiple viewpoints. And so I've been lucky that readers are passing along the book to each other, and word is getting out from actual readers to readers. But the press has been more challenging with this book.
Yeah, it is. It's very strange. I mean, obviously at JWA, we believe in books and we believe in writing and we believe in the power of culture to shape how we understand the world. And certainly that is true for me, but I think it's true for many of us that like we make sense of the world by encountering stories in different places. It builds our empathy, it builds our insight into the headlines, and we can't spend all of our time, looking at our news apps without losing our minds. So it's good to have other ways to get into the stories and learn about the world.
I
Uh,
agree completely.
we have a question from Pramila about whether you can share any tips on editing your novels. What's the editing process like?
My best tip is do as much of it as you can. For me, I find the most difficult part of writing the first draft. I heard this quote that I live by that the first draft, you're just putting sand in the sandbox so that later you can come back and build castles.
Hmm.
And it's taken that quote, I feel, has taken a lot of the pressure off of the first draft because you're just putting in the sand. But I firmly believe that the more times you go through it and taking some time away to let things like simmer and give yourself, sleep on an idea, let it sit for a minute and then come back to it. And you see things with new eyes, even if it's just the next day. So my best advice really is to just go through the draft as many times as you possibly can force yourself to do, and also take a breather and then do it again.
And how I know that writers have very different processes in terms of how much they kind of map things out and how much they let characters kind of present themselves or they let the plot unfold. Where do you fall on that spectrum?
I would say I'm like a centrist. I start out, I know my question at the beginning. I know how it's, I know, and I know my answer. I know, and those don't change. Like I know where I want it to go because on some level, I do write with an agenda. My agenda being like, I want my books to teach a positive message in some way. Um, so I will start writing and I think I know where it's going to go, but I have learned from my own first book where I outlined, in great detail, started writing, and by chapter 2 was like going in a very different direction, spent many days re-outlining, getting it all set again, going back to work. Chapter 3, I was in a new place and had to and I was like, all right, forget it with the outline. And I find that it's for me more productive to just let the characters lead me. And then I know there are times where I'm like, well, I know we have to get from this place of conflict to resolution and what has to happen. And so it's chapter by chapter for me.
Hmm. And Ellen asks, how do you know when the book is finished?
Ah. It's never finished. If you gave me back like my other books, would start editing them again. At some point, I think you know that it's finished enough. But I really don't know. I mean, like for my most recent book, I had a deadline and I was, it's finished because the deadline is here.
Yeah.
But I think you can kind of always make it better.
And what is your relationship like with your books once they're published? Like, do you feel like you miss the characters, you're tired of the characters, you're still kind of in their heads, or you sort of, you can't even remember what happens in the story anymore?
Um, I don't I don't let them go. It's like they become a part of me in the same way that, like, your old high school friends are still like a part of your consciousness, and like you can see something and it reminds you of them, or they would think that was funny. The characters stay with me in that way. But it's also like I'm in my next phase of life, and in the way that high school was another period, now I'm in, book six. And I don't miss them because I kind of they live in me. But I definitely do move on to the next thing.
Um, Carla, who I think said she lives in Chappaqua, is asking where in Westchester you live.
Oh, I'm in Mamaroneck, so not far.
Not far. It's one of the things that we love is we get people from really all over the world. One of the first things I do every week is look at the participants and what countries they came from, and I love that. I think this year in our virtual programs we've had people from 15 different countries,
Oh my goodness.
which is always fun for us.
Well, for people who are far away, I'm always happy to do a Zoom book club for if you have like personal book clubs. But and for the people in Westchester, I'll come and show up in person if anybody wants me to.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Well, we are nearing the end of our hour, so I want to thank you so much, Jackie, for this conversation. This was really, really rich and interesting, and thank you for the book and for doing such a great job of weaving in history and imagination and the present day in a way that I think is really uh, insightful and important for us to consider. So I encourage people to read. Thanks to all of you who are with us here tonight. We're always glad to gather. Um, oh, we have a request to know how we can contact you, Jackie. Is your website the best way?
My website, yep, there's a tab that says contact. There's my emails on there. There's also a form if that's easier. But yeah, JacquelineFriedland.com.
Okay, great. Mickey, maybe you can pop that into the chat while I wrap things up here. Perfect. Thank you. So, as I always say, there's always more to discover at JWA. As I said, we have a ton of material about reproductive rights and reproductive justice. And one of the things I didn't say that I think is really important about this book is that it is exploring an area of reproductive justice beyond abortion, which we hear about a lot and which is really important and certainly very pressing these days. We're just past the third anniversary of the Dobbs decision. Um, but there are so many ways that these issues play out, and sometimes I think in the States, because of the particular politics around abortion, we tend to think that the only reproductive right is abortion, and of course, anything that has to do with the right to not bear children or to bear children, and the ways that that happens are all in that package. So I wanted to suggest a couple of articles that we have on our site that would be interesting for people. In our encyclopedia, you can learn more about the role of eugenics in the American birth control movement. As I said, we have many articles about reproductive justice. I was rereading one today by one of our past interns who wrote an essay about reproductive justice and forced sterilizations specifically, which was lovely. I mean, forced sterilizations are not lovely. The essay is lovely. This is the final book talk of this series, and we will be taking our summer break, but have no fear. JWA virtual programs will be back in the fall, starting with a history course on Jewish women in the American South, which will be in September. And then we'll have more book talks in October and November. Um, I hope that we will see you all then. In the meantime, summer is a great time to catch up on any book talks you might have missed. We have been doing these almost every week since March of 2020, so there's a lot of them. You can find those on our site and the link that is in the chat. We also have, at this point, 129 episodes of our podcast, which is called Can We Talk? The spring season of the podcast just wrapped up this week, so you can check those out too. And of course, we recommend summer reading from our book list, where you will find this book among many others. And finally, JWA's fiscal year ends on Monday. If you have already made a donation to support our work, thank you so much. We are so grateful to you for being part of this community. If you have enjoyed JWA programming, please consider making a donation so that we can continue to provide the many programs and resources that we offer, and programs like this one. I am wishing everybody a safe, restorative, and above all, peaceful summer. Thank you for being with us. Until next time, take care, everybody, and take care of each other. And thank you, Jackie, for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Good night, everybody.